The readings confirm it. The anomaly is expanding. Our shields cannot hold. We must act. Agreed. Initiate the protocol. What is it you want from us?
We are here to survive.
At what cost?
The observation deck of Station Zenith smelled of polished ozone and misplaced pride. Supreme Commander Valcor stood near the sweeping viewport, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. At 78 standard cycles, his carapace bore the faded, jagged scars of the border skirmishes from a lifetime ago. He was an old soldier, and old soldiers knew the difference between a weapon and a toy. Around him, the Grand Chamber hummed with the self-congratulatory chatter of the galaxy's elite. 4 commanders from the most dominant empires in known space had gathered for the Centennial Military Summit. To Valcor, it felt less like a strategic briefing and more like a peacock exhibition. On the central hololith, a projection of the Aetheris Concord's newest flagship rotated in brilliant, blinding colors. It was a vessel of sweeping curves and iridescent light trailing elegant ribbons of plasma. Notice the harmonization of the primary energy emitters, boasted Commander Illyra. Her robes flowed like liquid silver, untouched by dust or debris. Our shields do not merely block kinetic impact. They vaporize it upon contact, turning enemy ordnance into harmless photons. It is not just defense, it is art. The other commanders murmured in polite, envious agreement. The reptilian warlord of the Vrock Dominion grunted approval, his own heavy armor polished to a mirror shine. The insectoid strategist of the Swarm Ascendancy clicked its mandibles, calculating the energy output with cold precision. Valcor watched the holographic display in silence. Art. They were calling warfare art. It was the privilege of generations that had not seen a burning sky in 2 centuries. They built ships to look intimidating in orbit, relying on the theory of deterrence rather than the brutal arithmetic of survival. Their weapons were designed by philosophers and engineers who had never felt the deck plates heave under the impact of a hull breach. The heavy blast doors of the observation deck slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss. The room grew quiet. The summit was scheduled to begin, and the final representative had arrived. The galaxy's newest, most controversial addition, humanity. Valcor turned his ancient eyes toward the entrance, expecting to see a display of overcompensation. When a lesser species was invited to the high table, they usually arrived drowning in ceremonial armor, preceded by honor guards and blaring trumpets, desperate to prove they belonged. Instead, a single man walked into the room. Commander Gideon Vance did not march. He walked with a measured, deliberate stride. He was 62 years old, his hair the color of oxidized iron, cut ruthlessly short. There was no cape, no gleaming breastplate, no bioluminescent insignia. He wore a simple charcoal gray uniform of heavy fabric. It looked pressed but worn at the cuffs. The boots hitting the polished floor were not ceremonial dress shoes. They were scuffed leather and composite steel. Field boots. He moved like a man stepping into a dark room, sweeping the corners with his eyes before committing his weight. His hands were empty, resting loosely near his sides. Illyra of the Concord offered a delicate, condescending smile. Commander Vance, we were beginning to wonder if your hyperdrives had malfunctioned, or perhaps your navigation computers struggled to find Station Zenith. Traffic in the outer corridor, Gideon said. His voice was gravel and low thunder. It did not echo, but it carried to every corner of the room. My apologies for the delay. The Vrock warlord stepped forward, towering nearly 2 feet over the human. You come alone, human. And where is your grand vessel? The scanners show nothing entering the sector matching a capital-class signature. Did you leave your mighty warship at home out of embarrassment? A few of the younger aides in the room chuckled. Valcor did not. The old Zalari commander was watching Gideon's eyes. They were a pale, washed-out blue like winter ice. When the giant Vrock warlord stepped into his personal space, Gideon did not flinch. He did not puff out his chest or raise his chin. His breathing remained slow and even. Valcor had seen that stillness before. It was the terrifying calm of an apex predator that knew exactly how much distance it needed to snap a neck. My ship is holding position at the edge of the system, Gideon replied, his tone perfectly flat. Standard quarantine protocol. Quarantine? Illyra laughed, a high musical sound. Against what? We have cured every major pathogen in the sector. Your primitive biology is perfectly safe here, Commander. It is not a medical quarantine, Gideon said. It is a tactical one. The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. The swarm strategist clicked its mandibles rapidly. Your species has possessed faster than light travel for merely a century. You bring no honor guard. You wear no armor. You project no energy fields. By our metrics, humanity is an infant stumbling in the dark. Why are you even at this summit, Commander? Gideon slowly turned his gaze to the insectoid alien. Then he looked at the holographic display where the glowing artistic ships of the Empire slowly spun in their majestic glory. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, battered metal datapad. The casing was scratched and dented. We were invited, Gideon said quietly, because the Council wanted to evaluate our threat level. You want to know if we are worth trading with or if we are weak enough to be conquered. Elira's smile vanished. That is an incredibly blunt and offensive assessment. It is the truth, Gideon said. He walked past the towering alien commanders moving to the edge of the hololith. He didn't look up at the towering aliens. He looked at the projection of their ships. You build beautiful machines. You build weapons that look like sunlight. You talk about war like it is a diplomatic disagreement played out on a chessboard. Gideon finally looked up, and his pale eyes locked directly onto Veilcor. The old Zalari felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down his spine. You look at me, Gideon continued, his voice dropping an octave, and you see a primitive. You see a man in a plain suit from a world that just figured out how to bend space. You wonder why we do not wear our pride on our sleeves. You wonder why we do not boast. Gideon tapped a single button on his battered datapad. The glowing, beautiful alien ships on the hololith vanished. In their place, a rolling sequence of numbers appeared. This is not a list of our trade exports, Gideon said, the silence in the room now absolute. This is a ledger. Before humanity ever broke the atmosphere of our home world, before we ever looked at the stars and thought we might not be alone, we fought. The numbers climbed. Hundreds, thousands. You have enjoyed peace for 200 years, Gideon said, his eyes scanning the room, landing on each commander, holding them accountable. In the last 500 years alone, humanity has fought 300 major global conflicts. In our recorded history, we have waged over 15,000 wars against ourselves. The Vrock warlord let out a low, disbelieving hiss. Impossible. No species survives that level of internal destruction. You would have eradicated yourselves. We came close, Gideon said. There was no pride in his voice, only a heavy, bone-deep weariness. More times than I care to admit. We fought over land. We fought over water. We fought over ideas. We broke the atom and used it to burn our own cities to ash. We poisoned our oceans and choked our skies. And every time we pushed ourselves to the brink of extinction, we learned something. Gideon stepped away from the hololith. He clasped his hands behind his back, mirroring Veilcor's veteran stance perfectly. We learned that war is not art, Gideon said softly. It is not a performance. It is the grim, mechanical application of violence to ensure survival. We do not build ships to look beautiful. We do not design weapons to impress our neighbors. Elira scoffed, though her voice trembled slightly. Words. Just words to hide the fact that your technology is centuries behind ours. Gideon looked at her. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, a gray stone in a room full of glass. I did not come here to threaten you, Gideon said. I came here to listen, to observe. My ship remains at the system's edge because we do not point our guns at people we are trying to understand. He turned his gaze back to Veilcor, offering a slow, respectful nod, a soldier recognizing a soldier. But do not mistake our restraint for weakness. Gideon finished, his voice barely more than a whisper that carried the weight of a collapsing star. We are quiet because we know exactly what happens when the talking stops. The summit plunged into a breathless void. The arrogant smiles had melted. The boasting had ceased. Veilcor stood rooted to the floor. The other commanders saw a primitive human making desperate excuses. But Veilcor saw the truth. He looked at the frayed cuffs of Gideon's uniform. He looked at the battered metal of his datapad. He looked at the cold, dead calm in the human's eyes. This was not a species that had stumbled into the stars by accident. This was a species that had clawed its way out of hell, dragging its own corpses behind it. They hadn't built a society of artists and philosophers who occasionally fought. They had built a society of survivors who occasionally rested. Veilcore felt a deep primal knot tighten in his gut. He realized with the sudden terrifying clarity of an old soldier standing in the presence of overwhelming force that the galaxy had made a terrible miscalculation. They had invited a wolf into a room full of sheep, and the sheep were mocking the color of its fur. The HSS Ironclad did not glide into the sector. It tore its way out of the subspace like a rusted knife through silk. On the observation deck of Station Zenith, the alien commanders gathered at the viewport to judge humanity's sword. What they saw made them laugh. The Ironclad was a brutalist slab of hyper-dense alloy. It had no glowing plasma nacelles, no sweeping aerodynamic wings, no shimmering, iridescent energy shields. It was entirely black, absorbing the starlight rather than reflecting it. It looked like a floating anvil. It was a ship built by people who knew that in the freezing vacuum of space, nobody cared what you looked like. Commander Elira covered a delicate laugh with her silver-gloved hand. "It is a flying tomb, Commander Vance. Do your people transport freight in your warships? Where are the thermal deflectors? Where are the phase shift barriers?" The Vrock warlord snorted, crossing his massive arms. "A single volley from my vanguard would reduce that flying brick to molten slag. It is completely unprotected." Gideon Vance stood by the glass, his hands resting easily behind his back. He did not look embarrassed. He did not defend the design. He just watched his ship drift into its holding position. "Armor plating," Gideon said simply. 3 meters of depleted uranium mesh and titanium carbide honeycomb. "Armor plating," the swarm strategist clicked, shaking its head. "How quaint, how terribly physical." Veilcore did not laugh. The old Zalari admiral stared at the dark, silent mass of the ironclad. It was ugly, it was slow, but as he looked at the massive recessed trenches running the length of the human ship's spine, a cold knot formed in his stomach. Those weren't cargo bays. Before Veilcore could ask what they were, the station klaxon shrieked. It was not a diplomatic chime. It was the raw, ear-splitting scream of a maximum-level threat. The lights on the observation deck flickered and shifted to a harsh, blood-red emergency hue. The space outside the viewport warped. The stars smeared into ugly streaks of purple and bruised black. Then the sky tore open. They did not announce themselves. They did not hail the station. The Eclipse fleet poured out of the siege spatial rupture, a nightmare of ancient automated geometry. They were pale, jagged monoliths, leftovers from a forgotten war millions of years old. Dead machines that knew only how to cleanse. "Battle stations," the Vrock warlord roared, slapping a communication node on his wrist. "All vessels lock targets. Burn them to ash." Elira's eyes widened in panic as she watched the swarm of monoliths descend. "Form up the fleet, maximum shielding." Outside, the glittering armada of the galaxy's greatest empires moved to engage. Elira's magnificent ships flared brightly, their phase shields glowing like miniature suns. The Vrock dreadnoughts powered up their devastating plasma lances. Veilcore activated his command uplink, preparing to drop his stealth cruisers into the enemy's flank. The lead Eclipse monolith pulsed. It was a silent detonation, a rippling, invisible shockwave of absolute anti-energy. It washed over the alien armada in a heartbeat. The results were catastrophic. Elira's beautiful iridescent shields shattered like cheap glass. The glowing ribbons of light surrounding her flagship flickered, hissed, and died. The Vrock plasma lances, charging to full capacity, choked. Their containment fields failed under the EMP wave, detonating inside their own firing chambers. 3 of the massive reptilian warships blew themselves apart from the inside out, silently turning into blooming spheres of fire. Veilcore stared in absolute horror. His command uplink went dead. His stealth cruisers, stripped of their energy-bending camouflage, suddenly appeared naked in the void, instantly targeted by the ancient machines. "No," Veilcore whispered. "Our systems. The energy matrix is gone." The Eclipse fleet did not hesitate. They moved with terrifying mechanical efficiency. Silent beams of concentrated antimatter pierced the unshielded alien hulls. Beautiful ships were carved into burning scrap. Escape pods were systematically hunted and vaporized. "My drones!" the swarm strategist shrieked. "The neural link is severed. They are falling out of the sky." Elira fell to her knees. her silver robes trembling as she watched her grand, artistic flagship list aimlessly, its power core completely dead. It was taking heavy fire-venting atmosphere and frozen bodies into the dark. "We are defenseless," the Vrock warlord growled, his voice thick with sudden, unfamiliar terror. The station. They are targeting the station. Station Zenith held 3 million civilians, politicians, families, traitors. It had no weapons. Its defensive screens were gone, wiped out by the same pulse that crippled the fleet. Death was coming cold and calculated. Veilcor's hands shook. He had fought in 100 campaigns, but he had never felt entirely powerless. Their technology, their pride, their centuries of superiority all wiped out by a single electromagnetic pulse. They had built weapons of light and energy, and the enemy had simply turned off the switch. The old admiral slowly turned his head. Through the chaos, the screaming and the flashing red lights, one man had not moved. Gideon Vance stood exactly where he had been before the attack. His hands were still clasped behind his back. His breathing was perfectly even. The red emergency lights washed over his weathered face, highlighting the deep lines of a man who had seen the abyss long before today. He was not looking at the dying alien fleet. He was looking at his plain, battered datapad. Commander Veilcor croaked in his voice cracking. "Your ship! Run! Tell your world what happened here!" Gideon slowly looked up from his screen. He met Veilcor's terrified gaze. There was no panic in the human's pale eyes. There was only a cold, terrifying focus. "We don't run," Gideon said softly. He raised his right hand and tapped the primitive analog earpiece hooked over his ear. It was a hardwired closed-circuit comm, unaffected by the energy dampeners. "Aegis Actual, this is Vance," Gideon spoke into the mic. His voice was absolute iron. "The enemy has disabled plasma and energy shielding. The field is clear." A crackle of static replied, followed by a voice just as calm as his. "Copy Actual. Firing solutions locked." Gideon looked out the viewport, staring down the ancient armada of the Eclipse. "Show them," Gideon ordered. The HSS Ironclad awoke. It did not flare with elegant light. It did not hum with the delicate vibration of a phase drive. It moved with the brutal, violent shove of high-yield fusion thrusters. Exhaust ports the size of city blocks ignited, spewing blinding white cones of raw chemical fury into the dark. Veilcor pressed his weathered hands against the viewport glass. The emergency sirens of Station Zenith wailed behind him, but his mind was entirely focused on the black slab of human engineering outside. The Eclipse EMP wave had washed over the human vessel just as it had the rest of the fleet, but the ironclad had not died. Its lights did not flicker. Its engines did not choke. "How?" Elira whispered, her voice trembling as she crawled toward the glass, her silver robes stained with soot from a blown console. "The anti-energy pulse. It neutralized everything." "How are they moving?" Gideon Vance did not turn around. He stood with his hands locked behind his back, a statue carved from gray stone. "You build your ships around complex energy grids," Gideon said, his voice cutting through the panic of the observation deck. "Fiber optics, plasma conduits, quantum matrices, beautiful, efficient, and entirely fragile." Out in the void, the ironclad was rotating. Heavy physical thrusters fired in rapid staccato bursts, maneuvering the millions of tons of hyperdense alloy with agonizing precision. "Humanity survived the atomic age," Gideon continued. His pale eyes locked on the approaching Eclipse monoliths. "We learned early that the first casualty of real war is the power grid, so we don't rely on it. The ironclad's command architecture isn't digital. It's analog, hardwired, shielded in lead, and 3 meters of composite steel. You can't hack a physical circuit, Commander Elira, and you can't EMP a sledgehammer." Valcor's 3 hearts pounded against his ribs. He understood. It wasn't primitive engineering. It was paranoia. It was a military doctrine born from species-wide trauma. They expected the lights to go out. They built their monsters to fight in the dark. The massive recessed trenches running down the spine of the ironclad suddenly split open. Heavy interlocking plates of armor retracted with a mechanical grinding so violent the station's sensors picked up the micro-vibrations through the vacuum. From the dark chasms of the ship's hull, twin barrels emerged. They were not glowing. They were not charging plasma. They were terrifyingly dark, flanked by massive coiled electromagnets. Target lock acquired? The radio crackled in Gideon's earpiece. Send it, Gideon said. There was no blinding flash of laser light. There was no elegant beam of plasma. There was only the violent, terrifying physics of mass and acceleration. The ironclad shuddered. The massive shub, a vessel the size of a city, physically recoiled, pushed backward by the sheer apocalyptic force of its own weapon. From the magnetic rails, two solid slugs of tungsten carbide, each weighing 2 tons, were hurled into the void at 5% the speed of light. They crossed the battlefield in a fraction of a heartbeat. The lead Eclipse monolith, a nightmare of ancient, unyielding geometry, had no time to process the threat. It had advanced energy shields designed to absorb and dissipate heat radiation and plasma. It was not designed to stop a 2-ton rock moving at 50 million miles per hour. The tungsten slugs hit the monolith. The kinetic transfer was absolute. The void did not light up with a fiery explosion. There was no oxygen to burn. Instead, the ancient machine simply shattered. The kinetic energy ripped through its shielded hull like a high-velocity bullet through a pane of thin glass. The monolith deformed, cracked, and then violently blew apart into a million jagged pieces of tumbling shrapnel. The sheer kinetic shockwave of the disintegrating metal tore into the 2 Eclipse ships flying behind it, shearing off their stabilization fins and sending them spinning helplessly into the dark. On the observation deck, the breath left Voilcourt's lungs. The swarm strategist stumbled backward, its mandibles clicking in absolute shock. The Vrock warlord, a creature who worshipped destructive power, fell completely silent. They had just watched the most advanced, terrifying threat in known space get swatted out of the sky by the equivalent of a thrown rock. They tried to box humanity in with rules of energy and light, Gideon said softly, finally turning to look at the alien commanders. They only gave us momentum. We don't manipulate energy to kill our enemies. We deliver mass. The ironclad did not stop. Its autoloaders, entirely mechanical and immune to the EMP, slammed fresh tungsten rounds into the breach. The magnetic coils shrieked. The ship fired again and again. Each thunderous recoil pushed the ironclad backward, but every shot found its mark. The Eclipse fleet, programmed to counter energy signatures, was completely blind to cold, dead metal, moving at relativistic speeds. Monolith after monolith was caved in, gutted, and reduced to drifting scrap. But the ancient machines were learning. Realizing the black slab of the human ship could not be disabled, the surviving Eclipse vessels shifted their formation. They ignored the ironclad. They turned their geometric pale hulls toward the massive rotating rings of Station Zenith. Commander Voilcourt shouted, his veteran instincts taking over. They are targeting the civilian sectors. The station has no armor. 3 million lives. I know, Gideon interrupted. He did not raise his voice, but the absolute authority in his tone silenced the Zalari admiral instantly. Gideon tapped his earpiece. Aegis actual. They are shifting fire to the soft target. Intercept. Copy actual. Brace for impact. Voilcourt watched in awe as the ironclad fired its lateral thrusters. It did not try to outrun the enemy fire. It did not try to project a magical field of energy. It simply drove itself directly into the line of fire. The human dreadnought threw its massive 3-meter-thick hull between the Eclipse fleet and the station. It became a wall, a shield of meat and metal. The Eclipse ships opened fire. Beams of concentrated antimatter and thermal radiation slammed into the ironclad's broadside. The human ship shuddered violently. Slabs of its depleted uranium armor glowed cherry red, then white hot. Liquid metal sloughed off the hull, freezing instantly in the vacuum. Warning sirens screamed over Gideon's comm channel. Voilcourt could hear the chaotic shouts of damage control teams, the screech of tearing metal, the frantic calls for medics. The humans were bleeding. They were burning. But the ship did not move. It held its position, taking the apocalyptic punishment meant for the alien civilians behind it. Your crew, Elira whispered, tears streaming down her flawless face as she watched the ironclad absorb the devastating barrage. They are dying for us. Why we mocked you. We called you primitive. Gideon's jaw tightened. He watched the readouts on his datapad as casualty reports flashed across the cracked screen. His eyes were heavy with the burden of command, but his posture never broke. Because we know what it means to be defenseless. Gideon said, his voice rough with emotion he refused to let break. We fight like demons so we can protect like angels. That is the burden of the strong. Veilcore stared at the human commander. In his 78 cycles, he had seen empires rise and fall. He had seen warlords boast of their cruelty and politicians boast of their mercy. But he had never seen this. He was looking at a species that had mastered the horrific, brutal arithmetic of war, not to conquer the galaxy, but to be the shield that guarded the weak. "Commander!" the radio crackled. The voice of the ironclad's captain was strained, fighting through pain. "Armor integrity at 40%. We have drawn their main capital ship into the kill zone. They are lined up." Gideon took a deep, slow breath. He looked out at the massive geometric shape of the Eclipse command ship, hovering directly in front of the ironclad, preparing to deliver the killing blow. "Finish it," Gideon ordered. Beneath the burning, melting belly of the ironclad, a set of armored doors slid open. This was not a standard railgun. This was the ship's spine, the primary mass driver. The firing sequence did not just shake the ironclad, it visibly warped the space around it. A single monumental slug of hyper-dense matter was unleashed. It didn't pierce the Eclipse command ship, it erased it. The kinetic shockwave ripped the monolith in half, detonating its dark energy core in a silent, blinding flash of collapsing physics. Without their command node, the remaining Eclipse drones went dead, drifting aimlessly into the void like ghosts. The battle was over. Out in the dark, the ironclad vented atmosphere and cooling gas. It was scarred. It was burned. It looked like a battered piece of scrap iron. To Veilcore, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The docking umbilical connecting Station Zenith to the HSS Ironclad did not hum with anti-gravity fields or glow with soft, welcoming light. It was a ribbed tube of cold industrial rubber and reinforced steel. It smelled of scorched carbon-copper blood and venting coolant. Supreme Commander Veilcore walked down the corridor, his heavy boots echoing in the narrow space. Behind him walked Alara, the swarm strategist, and the giant Vrock warlord. None of them spoke. The arrogant chatter that had filled the observation deck hours ago was gone, replaced by the stunned, reverent silence of survivors. They had been invited aboard the human dreadnought not as dignitaries, but as witnesses. The heavy blast doors of the ironclad's secondary hangar ground open. Veilcore braced himself. He expected the raucous, chest-beating celebration of a primitive warrior race. He expected the humans to be standing on the wreckage of their enemies, raising their weapons in a barbaric display of triumph. He had seen 100 mercenary fleets act exactly that way after a brutal victory. But as the smoke cleared, Veilcore saw only discipline. The hangar deck was massive, cavernous, and stripped of all vanity. It was a sea of gray metal and flashing amber hazard lights. But what stopped the Zalari admiral in his tracks was the silence. There was no cheering. There was only the grim, focused murmur of a military machine transitioning from combat to recovery. Rows of folding cots stretched across the deck. Floodlights illuminated makeshift surgical tables. Veilcore watched as heavily armored human marines, the same soldiers who had just stared down annihilation, gently carried stretchers bearing the wounded. And the wounded were not just human. Alara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. On the triage cots lay the survivors from the destroyed alien armada. Vrock shock troopers, their impenetrable armor shattered, were being treated by human field medics. Swarm drone pilots, their delicate neural wings crushed by the EMP, were being carefully stabilized with intravenous fluids. Even a few Zalari crew members from Veilcore's own crippled stealth cruisers were resting under thermal blankets. "By the stars," Alara whispered, stepping forward. A human medic, his gray uniform stained with blue Vrock blood and crimson human blood alike, gently guided an injured Concord navigator to a resting area. The medic did not ask for their rank. He did not ask for their empire's diplomatic status. He only checked their vitals, applied a tourniquet, and moved to the next bleeding body. "They are treating our people," the Vrock warlord rumbled, his deep voice stripped of all its former hostility. He stared at a human nurse who was expertly wrapping a pressure bandage around a massive Vrock warrior's severed arm. "My vanguard. We mocked them. We called them weak. And they are using their own medical supplies to save our soldiers." "It is their law," Veilcore said quietly, his ancient eyes taking in the sheer unyielding professionalism of the scene. "I have read their histories. though I did not understand them until now. They call it the rules of armed conflict. Even in the absolute chaos of war, they bind themselves to a code of mercy. They do not torture. They do not abandon the helpless. They fight with the ferocity of predators, but they govern themselves with the discipline of monks. Veilcore walked deeper into the hangar. He was looking for one man. He found Gideon Vance standing near a tactical plotting table at the far end of the deck. The human commander did not look like a savior. He looked like an old, tired man who had just finished a long shift at a dangerous job. Gideon's uniform was scorched. A thick white bandage was wrapped tightly around his left forearm, seeping a small circle of red. He held a battered datapad in his right hand, slowly signing off on digital casualty reports. A young lieutenant stood beside him, speaking in hushed, efficient tones. Veilcore approached, stopping 2 paces away. He stood at perfect attention, a gesture of absolute, undeniable military respect. Gideon finished signing the report, handed the pad to the lieutenant, and finally looked up. His pale blue eyes were exhausted, but they still held that terrifying, unmovable calm. "Commander Vance," Veilcore said. His voice echoed slightly in the massive hangar. The other alien commanders, Ilara the Vrock, the Swarm, gathered behind the old Zolari admiral. They too stood in respectful silence. "Admiral," Gideon replied softly, "your civilians on the station are secure. We have engineering teams restoring your life support grids. It will take time, but the air will hold." Veilcore looked at the bandage on Gideon's arm, then at the hundreds of cots filling the hangar. "You took the fire meant for us. You sacrificed your own crew, your own armor, to shield a station full of people who did nothing but insult your world. The people on that station were non-combatants," Gideon said simply, as if explaining a basic law of physics. "We do not let non-combatants die if we have the armor to stop it. That is not a strategy, Admiral. That is a baseline requirement for being human." Ilara stepped forward, bowing her head. The shimmering silver of her robes was ruined, but she no longer cared about looking majestic. "We were fools. We built ships to look like gods, but we forgot how to be soldiers. If your fleet had not been here, if my fleet were not here, you would have burned," Gideon said. It was not a boast. It was a cold, historical fact. "You thought our history of war was a mark of savagery, but you forgot that a sword forged in fire is infinitely stronger than one carved from glass." The Vrock warlord stepped up beside Veilcore. The giant reptilian beast, who respected nothing but pure strength, slowly brought his massive fist to his chest and bowed at the waist. "Your vessel is ugly human, but its teeth are sharp. The Dominion will never again question the strength of Earth." Gideon looked at the giant alien. "Keep your weapons sharp, warlord, but remember who you point them at. Power without restraint is just noise." Veilcore looked around the hangar one last time. He saw the grim, stoic faces of the human Marines. He saw the battered, blackened bulkheads of the ironclad. This was not a species looking to conquer the galaxy. Conquerors demanded tribute. Conquerors demanded fear. These humans demanded nothing but the quiet space to exist and the right to stand between the darkness and the light. "The galaxy is vast, Commander Vance," Veilcore said, his voice thick with a profound, sudden gratitude. "And there are many ancient terrors hiding in the deep dark. The empires of this council have grown soft. We will need help. We will need allies who know how to navigate the storm." Gideon Vance looked out over the sea of wounded, watching his doctors save the lives of the aliens who had mocked them only hours before. He reached up and adjusted the collar of his simple charcoal gray uniform. He looked back at the alien commanders, his pale eyes catching the harsh glare of the hangar lights. "You don't need to worry about the dark anymore," Gideon said, his voice steady, carrying the unbreakable promise of an entire species. "When someone calls for help, Earth will answer." Veilcore closed his eyes and nodded. The boasting was over. The era of bright, fragile ships and arrogant posturing had died today. In its place, a new doctrine had been written in tungsten and blood. Humanity had not arrived among the stars to be ruled, and they had not come to rule. They had come to stand guard.